Let's say you're at work and you get an invite to an office birthday party for your coworker Kylie. And you're excited, but you're also worried that the party will be a disaster. That's because the leaders of the party planning committee have a hard time working together to achieve their goals. And just like you expected, they totally ruin the party by fighting about who's responsible for misspelling Kylie's name on the cake, which means that their poor communication negatively affected everyone in the office. As coworkers, our party planners Dwayne and Tim and their entire team depend on each other to keep their workplace running smoothly. So everyone would benefit if they learned some better strategies for dealing with conflict. In all of our relationships, how we communicate with each other has the power to deepen the relationship or end it. So if we want to build healthy relationships and plan successful birthday parties, we need to be aware of what behaviors and styles of communication are harbingers of doom. Not to be overdramatic. I'm Cassandra Ryder, and this is Study Hall, Intro to Human Communication. As we've said before, we're always communicating. And good communication is super important in interpersonal relationships because the choices we make affect each other on a daily basis. After all, these are the people we live with, work with, and count on to have our backs. So whether we're negotiating a chore chart, picking a restaurant for dinner, or planning a coworker's birthday party, we have to work together if we want our relationships to thrive. But because nobody's perfect, even the best communicators encounter conflict in their relationships, which is when different people's goals clash in some way. In interpersonal relationships, conflict can look like a fight over how often the house should be cleaned or whether you should cook or eat out for dinner. The people involved might have different goals for how clean the house should be or how quickly dinner should be on the table. Conflict can also come up when it seems like there aren't enough resources to go around, like when we're planning a trip and have different ideas about how much money to spend on sightseeing, or when we have to get a project done at work and we disagree on how many overtime hours the team should put in. And while conflict can be uncomfortable, it can also be a good thing because it means people are expressing their feelings, as long as we treat each other with respect and work towards the best possible outcome for everyone involved. But there are also plenty of ways of dealing with conflict that we all should avoid, and these are what we're going to focus on in this episode. These behaviors can make conflict even worse and hurt our relationships in the process. Specifically, in 1992, American psychologist John Gottman identified 4 negative conflict management behaviors in his cascade model of relational disillusion, which is also called Gottman's 4 Horsemen. Gottman named his model after the biblical figures known as the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which in many interpretations portrayed the conquest, war, hunger, and death we'd expect to see at the end of the world, which is so dramatic. But while it's a little over the top, Gottman used the 4 horsemen metaphor to help us understand 4 conflict management behaviors that signal that our relationships are headed straight for disaster. In fact, in romantic relationships, studies have shown that repeated use of these behaviors is likely to lead to a breakup. And since breakups can also happen between friends, family members, and coworkers, I guess we could say the 4 horsemen really are signs of an apocalypse, but like mini apocalypses. The good news is that Gottman also found 4 strategies, or antidotes, that we can use to defeat the 4 horsemen. That's right, you can cancel the apocalypse. In your interpersonal relationships, at least. Gottman's first horseman rides in on complaints and criticism. Officially, Gottman just lists criticism as the first horseman, but complaints are important to pay attention to as they can sometimes lead to criticism. Though that's not to say that complaints are always a bad thing. Complaints are when we express dissatisfaction or annoyance about something, and they're a normal part of most relationships. In fact, complaints can even improve our interactions if they're about specific behaviors because they help us identify problems and make changes. Let's go back to our disastrous office birthday party for a second. Maybe Dwayne and Tim forgot Kylie's birthday, and they're planning a last-minute party to cover up their mistake. Kylie might be upset because they forgot. But instead of calling Dwayne and Tim inconsiderate jerks and throwing her cake out the window, she could explain that their carelessness really hurt her feelings, which is a complaint. And by expressing how their behavior affected her and made her feel, Kylie gives Dwayne and Tim information that they can use to make better decisions next time. But complaints can turn into criticism, and that's when things get worse. In a conflict, criticism is a personal attack that blames someone else for a problem. And criticism can lead to people feeling hurt and rejected, which can escalate a conflict that's already underway. So for instance, maybe Tim and Dwayne decide to blame each other for hurting Kylie's feelings. Tim calls Dwayne incompetent because he decorated the conference room with the ugliest balloons on the planet. And because Dwayne feels attacked, he pops a balloon right in Tim's face, which sends Tim storming out of the conference room to file a complaint with Human Resources. But you can defeat, or at least diffuse, criticism and complaints with what Gottman calls a gentle startup. Gentle startups involve making I statements that focus on something positive we want out of the conflict instead of making accusatory you statements. So instead of saying, Dwayne, your decorations are the worst, Tim could say, Dwayne, I feel like we can make Kylie's party a little more festive. Would you be willing to work with me to make the decorations really pop? Gentle startups like these are a great way to diffuse criticisms and complaints. And if we don't diffuse criticisms, they can escalate interpersonal conflict and lead to the second horseman, which is contempt. Contempt is when we say things that imply that we're better than other people, which means it's almost always condescending. And during a conflict, treating someone with contempt sends the message that other people are the problem, not us. So if Dwayne says, well, Tim, I don't know how your inferior little brain thought a plain vanilla cake was appropriate for this party. That would be an example of contempt. Here, Dwayne's implying that Tim's lack of intelligence led to a mistake that Dwayne never would have made. By assuming that he's better than Tim, Dwayne makes Tim feel bad, even though the cake was perfectly tasty and everyone liked it anyway. But in a perfect world, Dwayne would recognize Tim's hard work and appreciate it. So to defeat contempt, we have to try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes and appreciate their efforts. While Dwayne's first reaction might be frustration, ideally, he could change his reaction if he thinks about where Tim's coming from. Like, if Dwayne noticed that Tim put a lot of effort into ordering the cake, even though he had a tough week at work, he might react with more empathy. Ultimately, when we put ourselves in someone else's shoes, we build a relationship based on appreciation and respect. And by showing empathy when other people make mistakes, we can counteract contempt and focus on the things they've done right instead of the things they've done wrong. But when we're backed into a corner by a highlight reel of everything we've done wrong, that can lead to the third horseman, called defensiveness, which is when we get angry and play the victim in order to ward off an attack and avoid blame. When people get defensive, they might whine and complain, make excuses, or accuse others to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. So let's say Tim gets defensive about forgetting Kylie's birthday. He might make excuses about how no one told him the date of Kylie's birthday and he just totally forgot because he was so focused on catching up at work. Or when Kylie sees that her name is spelled wrong on the cake, Tim might blame the bakery instead of taking responsibility for his last-minute cake order. And if he's feeling really defensive, Tim might make accusations to deflect responsibility away from himself. Accusations usually involve you statements that make the other person feel like they're the only one at fault. So if Tim wanted to shift the blame onto Dwayne, he might say something like, you were supposed to remind me about Kylie's birthday, but you didn't because you think birthday parties are stupid. This awful party is all your fault. This birthday party and conflict are sounding pretty intense. But while defensiveness and accusations are intense, they're also a totally natural response to being called out or criticized, because no one likes to feel like they're being attacked. But it's important to remember that in most conflict situations, both people are at least somewhat responsible. And that's actually the best way to defeat defensiveness. By taking ownership of our actions, we reassure the other person that we're aware of our behavior and could take steps to change it in the future, which is the key to keeping strong connections with the people we care about. Finally, there's the last of the four horsemen, which is known as stonewalling. Someone stonewalls someone else when they want to avoid addressing the person and the behavior that upset them. Conflict can be uncomfortable, and sometimes people just don't feel like they have the capacity to respond to the other person's big feelings about a problem. I get it. I've got enough to worry about with my own feelings, let alone what someone else has going on. But instead of communicating that they need a break in healthy ways, someone who's stonewalling will totally block the other person out. For example, when Kylie realizes that Tim and Dwayne forgot her birthday, she might decide to pretend like neither of them exist, like total cold shoulder action. And when we shut down any chance of resolving the conflict, it's like a stone wall pops up between us and the other person involved. And while that wall is like a security blanket for the person who puts it up, it can feel like getting locked out on a cold night for anyone on the other side of the wall. Plus, now whoever we've stonewalled can't take an active role in resolving the conflict, which is pretty disrespectful. But just like the other horsemen, stonewalling can also be defeated, in this case through something called physiological self-soothing. When we're under stress, like during conflict, our bodies respond to that stress by showing physiological symptoms, which can include things like a racing heartbeat, clammy palms, or heavy breathing. It's normal for our bodies to respond to conflict in this way, and when it happens, we might want to shut everyone out. But it's okay to talk about how you feel and ask for a break instead. By stepping away and practicing self-soothing techniques like deep breathing, we can regain some calm and clarity. And when we come back to the conversation in a better frame of mind, we're more likely to resolve the conflict so that everyone feels respected, and the apocalypse is successfully avoided. Each horseman can show up individually or come together in ways that only escalate conflicts if we're not vigilant and careful. But understanding how criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling affect others can help us make better choices during conflict situations. Remember, we live our day-to-day lives with people we care about, and every positive interaction makes our connections even stronger. Whether you're communicating with friends, family, a partner, or the party planning committee at the office, knowing how to defeat the 4 horsemen is key to creating healthy relationships. Thanks for watching Study Hall, Intro to Human Communication, which is part of the Study Hall Project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you liked this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time!